So we're live. Hello and welcome to this event entitled Density, Design and Perception. This event is part of a bigger series called Progressing Planning, where we talk about planning issues from practical and academic points of view. My name is Fanny Blanc. I'm a researcher at LSE London, and some of my work has involved the research of residents experiencing high density in London. Before I introduce the fantastic speakers we have here today, I would just like to explain the setup of the event. We have 10 minutes presentation, so 10 minutes presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So if you have any question or any comments, you can leave them in the comment section on Facebook, and we'll make sure to address them during that time after the presentation. So I'm going to introduce the speakers, starting with Javier Iñigo. Javier is principal urban designer at Jacobs and the design leader for various master plans and cities regeneration strategies in the UK. Today, he will move away from the UK and talk about Madrid in Spain. Indeed, he's done a paper with Mace, who's also here today, on how residents' level of satisfaction relates to urban design qualities in Madrid. Next, we will hear from Beatrix Imo. Beatrix is practicing architect, director of specialist arch, and a researcher. She is Digital Initiative Zurich Fellow at Zürcher Hochschule für angewandte Wissenschaften and Senior Assistant at ETH Zurich. Beatrix holds a PhD from the Bartlett School of Architecture, and in which she explored how individuals experience urban spaces. Her interests lie in urban design, space syntax, and spatial cognition. And today she will use all this knowledge and all this expertise to talk to us about perceived urban density. Finally, we will hear from Mace. Alan is Associate Professor of Urban Planning Studies at LSE and is also a very dear colleague of mine. Before joining LSE in 2010, he worked as a special planner in London on policy development, and this experience has been so useful in helping him framing his current research. And today he will talk about his new paper, soon to be published, on reducing suburban residents' resistance to higher density development. And now, without further ado, here is our first speaker, Javier Iñigo.
Thank you, Fanny. Hello, everyone. Let me just share my screen for a second and we can start presenting. Let me know when you can see my screen. Cool. So today I will talk about this research paper Alan and I wrote a few years ago, the suburban perimeter blocks of Madrid, 10 years on, and how residents' level of satisfaction relates to urban design qualities. But the paper is there for everyone to read it. So if you want to go and do so, but I will say something about why I thought this was an important issue and why it was worth actually spending any time of it. One of the main reasons is on the screen now, why Spanish cities and especially Madrid were developing in this very specific way. At the same time, I was at the School of Architecture during the 2000s. A number of new city developments were going in Madrid, and they were called PAUs. So you will hear me saying that word probably a few times during the webinar today. And they were called PAUs after the regulatory mechanism to develop them. There was a widespread and clear line of thought about these developments, that they were against contemporary urban and architectural conventions, given some of their key characteristics, like the oversized public space. They were car-dominant developments. They had poor transport planning and poor public transport links. They had inward-looking block typologies to some extent, poor architectural diversity and creativity. But especially the main motive for this was because it was actually a new model of city that was being proposed and actually built. They had a very similar way where they were planned, designed, and built. But also, they are taking incredibly large levels of land. They are unprecedented levels of growth, and more importantly, they are greenfield development, as we'll see later on. So the research focused on San Gennaro on the screen, one of the most representative of these neighborhoods, which looks like this on the left of your screen at a 98% level of completion. And you can already see some of the elements mentioned earlier, like oversized road infrastructure, and the use of the perimeter block as the only topology really used throughout. And it's that, this topology, one of the protagonists of the paper, obviously even in the title, right? And just to put it a bit into context without going too much into detail, probably we don't have the time for that. Over the last couple of decades, there has been quite a recognition of the perimeter block as the paradigm in urban design, particularly in Spain, but also in some parts of Europe. But in Spain, we actually had a bit of a tradition with that, which is probably showing here a bit on the screen. So in the 19th century, one of the first examples here on the left of the screen, and following major population influx from the countryside, most cities found on the urban grid the most efficient way to arrange the land and develop and meet the housing demands, right? So as a result, perimeter blocks were the immediate response to that, and they became the consolidated urban areas we know today in most Spanish cities. So following that, modern architecture and the post-war period, there was a shift to using more open blocks on open green areas, as you see in the center image of the screen. And that transformed the interface between the buildings and the public spaces. But some decades later, that trend was reversed, coming back to the perimeter block as recognized the paradigm really to control that relation between buildings and public space. So the purpose of the paper was to find out how these neighborhoods that were a clear target of academic and professional criticism worked 10 years after being first inhabited by bringing together design criteria and the experience of the resident. We followed a specific methodology, which we won't talk much about today, but we obviously had a number of interviews with residents that went through a thematic analysis, and we used a theoretical framework from Kevin Leach's work of the Good City Form. So firstly, from the literature review and the backward research, confirmed or even exceeded to some extent most of those criticisms. So over 7,000 hectares of land were planned, which is equivalent to twice the size of the inner city, the consolidated center of Madrid. Given changes in land regulation at local, regional, and national levels, developable land in Madrid increased by 47% during the 90s and beginning of the 2000s. And the political justification for some of these was a shortage of developable land in previous city plans, increased demand of housing, and the need for affordable housing. But even though it wasn't really the purpose of this research, we found evidence that refuted most of those arguments. For instance, population only grew by 12% between 1993 and 2003, pretty much when these neighborhoods were actually being planned and developed. So just to show here on the screen the impact of that development, This is a map of Madrid, the whole municipality, and the city center. Recognize that the consolidated city center, you could say, is within the inner ring road, something like that kind of shape. You see the development going around that, with the first wave of these developments in orange, San Gennaro, the subject of the research, in red, and the rest in gray. So you can see immediately the comparison between the size of the city and the size of the developments being proposed. What happened as well is, and I think this is very relevant for this webinar today, but in all these developments, they were using the well-established perimeter block as the standard. But the residential densities they used were substantially lower than what you would expect normally from this type of typology. On the left, you can see two previous examples from the 80s and 90s in Madrid as well, where they were using densities of 90 and 50, for example, but they were much lower in the case of San Gennaro. So the overall residential density in San Gennaro is just below 34 dwellings per hectare, which is really low. Green open space ratio is also a lot higher than in previous examples, and is remarkable the amount of green area, which is over 30% of the total land. The block size is also larger than in previous developments, and that allowed the blocks to retract from the street because they had more space to play with. But that created the need to provide a fence to divide and separate the public and the private space, which is actually something you would avoid by using this typology. So it kind of is defeating the purposes of using these typologies, right? Then in terms of the results from the interviews, from their experience of the residents, and the results were very homogeneous. There was a clear appreciation of the environment where they lived, and they were very happy with the neighborhood. Some of the key themes emerging from the interviews were that San Gennaro is, in general, a pleasant place to live and dwell in, although it wasn't one of the questions we asked. But elements like the width of the streets, the sidewalks, the spaciousness in general were really appreciated by the residents. And they also highlighted the inner courtyards within the block typology that provided a safe environment for people and children to socialize and create links within the community. There were also positive results about air quality in San Gennaro compared to other areas of the city. But we actually looked into this and at the data provided by the municipality, which showed that average pollution is higher in San Gennaro than the one in Madrid city center, which is probably a result of these neighborhoods being often surrounded by infrastructure, but by big motorways, which makes the average pollution level be fairly high, although potentially the peaks not being so high, but more of a constant issue. There was a clear lack of identity, but that related mostly to the built environment. Some respondents noted that the local community and the amount of young families living in the area is actually what gives San Gennaro a particular identity. And that's actually not a bad thing, and it is even reflected in the theoretical framework we used. As you see on the screen, there's a quote by Lynch saying the quality of a place is due to the joint effect of the place and the society which occupies it. So it wasn't a bad thing at all. But then the public space design is one of the key elements, right? It's funny, it wasn't perceived there was so much green open space. Remember, 30% of the total green area, the total area was green open area, way over previous examples and normal practice. And that's due to the poor design of the green areas, normally at the edge of the development as a buffer from this infrastructure, rather than an integrated design in the plan. But also because of the poor maintenance of the open space, because there is just so much of it that it became unaffordable for the council to keep it in good condition. There are some clear conclusions that will need further research. It wasn't really the subject of this, but obviously there were really poor design procurement practices at the time, and the governing processes in urban planning and city making will need further be investigated. But obviously the development were conceived in times of a real estate boom. Spain was coming into the key players in the kind of global geopolitical environment, and that involved a certain kind of optimism while developing and planning these neighborhoods. So there was a clear oversupply of social infrastructure and open space, which in the end caused a number of public plots to remain unbuilt to date. And this created a fragmented and badly maintained urban areas. Also, the one typology fits all approach that we kind of described, that doesn't generate rich urban environments, nor provides a variety in the housing offer. And the typology used throughout seems to be at odds with the building density that were being proposed in these areas. But overall, it was remarkable that residents were not keen to trade off this spaciousness and these characteristics of the area for other aspects relative to what we know as the compact city, such as local retail, better maintained green areas, weather protection, better public transport, even to some extent, a safer environment. So residents' perceptions really challenged the compact city theory and convention, which we approach this study with. And a key cause of the dissatisfaction lies with the failure of to deliver all the public services planned rather than design issues themselves. So, and just to finish, probably the key takeaway from the research was that obviously there's a clear need for a further, much stronger alignment between everyday life experience, the design codes and practices, and public resources to achieve sustainable development. So that was all for me for now, Fanny. I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Javier. It was super interesting. Next, we'll hear from Beatrix about perceived urban density. Here's, I guess, it works.
Can you hear and see me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. So my name is Beatrix Imo, and I'm going to talk to you today about a project that is ongoing called Perceived Urban Density. As Fanny said, I'm an architect. I have a PhD from the Bartlett in architecture. I'm currently a digital initiative fellow at the Institute Urban Landscape at ZHAW, and I'm also a researcher at the chair of cognitive science at ETH Zurich. So I mix architecture and cognitive science in my research. And I also have my own company where I act as an architectural consultant. So the aim of the project was to understand how people perceive urban density. And specifically, the sub-question that I have tackled so far is whether people's rating of urban density is related to crowdedness. So crowdedness is presence of people. And Fanny talked at a workshop that I organized last year on the subject. And why perceived urban density? So this is a little bit of my background. So I have worked a lot with psychologists and cognitive scientists, and I really care about how the individual experiences space. And what strikes me about urban density is that while practicing architects and urban designers across the globe use a measure of urban density very often, it often doesn't fully take into account how the space is used and how an individual might actually perceive the environment. For example, two spaces with the same floor area ratio might be populated by different numbers of people, and so feel like they have very different densities. So this is a slide on previous literature that is topical for the situation in Switzerland. There was a very nice exhibition at the Swiss Architecture Museum, the poster for which you see is the colorful image kind of in the bottom middle. And it links also to the Experiencing Density project that Fanny mentioned at the beginning of LSE Cities, which she also talked about at the workshop we held last year. So in my remaining 8 minutes, I'm just going to give a very brief overview of the project that has been running so far. It's a 3-part project. The first part is on defining perceived urban density, and parts 2 and 3 were empirical. We collected data from people who rated how dense they found the space. In the first case in VR and subsequently also in the real world. So part 1, how do you define perceived urban density? So we ran an online questionnaire where we showed people 2 images of urban streetscapes, and we asked them just to rate which location is more dense, left or right. And what we did is we did image segmentation on the images to see what kind of factors people were preferring. And I have written this up in ECAD paper from 2017. And what we found, but it wasn't conclusive, was that people found 4 types of factors important when trying to rate which location was more dense. And these are the 4 factors. And if they had to single out any single factor that was the most important, they pointed to visibility. So that's how far you can see. So those were the types of parameters that we looked at out of a longer list that includes also presence of sky, presence of people, and whatnot. In the second part of the project, we try to see, okay, some people define urban density as relating to built matter, and some people find the presence of people the defining factor in how you define urban density. Actually, if you Wikipedia it, Wikipedia says it's all about the presence of people, and built matter is far less important. So I decided to tackle this question directly, and I chose a case study in Zurich that is relatively new and is located next to the main station. So it has a very high change of the number of people present in rush hour condition and in non-rush hour condition. And what participants did is they walked along a route, and either in virtual reality or physically in the real space. And at these 5 locations, they had to rate how dense they thought the space was. So here on the left, you see a screenshot of the VR condition for non-rush hour, so very few people, if any, present. And on the right, you see a photograph of the rush hour condition. And the question that the participants had to answer was, how dense do you rate this location? From a scale of 0, not dense at all, to 9, totally dense. And here is a video. The aim of this video is really to show off the fantastic virtual reality model that we created of the urban space, which I'm very proud of. And it's a fly-through. Just for presentation purposes, the participant had the egocentric view, physically walking through the environment. And this video switches between the condition you see now, where lots of people are present, and the condition where very few people are present. So I'll just let this play a second. Here you see an example of the not rush hour condition. And the video is going to be available on the slides afterwards if you want to take a look at the full-length video. And what we found was that people rated the space denser in the rush hour conditions. So where there were people present, they found that the space was more dense. And in a subsequent study, we repeated the exact same experimental design, but actually in the physical space. So we had the same experimental design. We had 100 participants, 50 for the rush hour condition, 50 for the non-rush hour, identical to the VR experiment. We had the same route. We had the same ratings of location on the same scale. And what we found was that people also rated the spaces as more dense in the condition where there were more people present. So it does seem that perceived urban density is related to crowdedness. And if you compare the findings from the real world study shown here on the left and the VR study here shown on the right, you can see that in both cases, the presence of people was critical. In the VR experiment, it was even more of a factor. And that's a brief overview of the work so far. It's an ongoing project, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to hearing more about this. And next and finally, we have Alan, who's going to present his paper.
So hello, I'm just going to attempt to share my screen here, and then I'll be with you.
Perfect.
Yeah, you got my screen. So, as the title suggests, this is a piece of work that fits actually very closely to the previous two presentations. So it's really focused on people's perceptions. And in this case, we're looking at both perception of density and acceptability of density. And we're focused on existing suburban residents, and I'll explain why. So for us, the problem in this piece of research was that there's a housing shortage, arguably a crisis in London. There's a constrained supply of land. If we need more housing and we have a limited land supply, the simple sum is that equals higher density in order to provide the amount of housing needed on that limited land supply. We were particularly focused on the suburbs as being places of relatively higher owner occupation than the central city. And our assumption was that any new development was likely to be resisted, given that homeowners are actually perfectly rationally seeking to protect their most significant asset, which is the value of their home. And if any development is likely to be resisted, then in particular, higher density development, we presume will be resisted even more, as being seen as a change in the urban form in the suburbs and as threatening the value of the housing asset. So our question was how important design was in reducing the resistance of existing residents to new build and at higher densities. And our idea was that we wanted to test, or one of our key ideas was whether design could impact both perception of density and acceptability of density, and in particular whether incorporating what we called vernacular urban forms would make the new build more acceptable. So by vernacular urban forms, things like pitched roofs rather than flat roofs for the suburbs, and broader urban design that would reflect the traditional front garden rather than not having any private space around the development. So like Beatrix's work, we were using virtual reality, and we were presenting a series of images. These weren't mobile walkthroughs, but rather they were static images that we had manipulated. And we had a landscaping set, so beyond just the building itself, so the degrees of setback of the buildings from the back of the pavement, the amount of public greenery, the amount of private greenery, and how different parking treatments. And then for the building itself, we presented 4 different typologies, looking at different types of fenestration, different degrees of articulation of the facades, different roofing, as I say, from flat to pitched with one other, and then also the material, the facade material. And these 8 different treatments or interventions were applied to 3 different densities, where effectively the heights of buildings were serving as a proxy for density. I'll show you a picture in a minute just to give you an idea of in more detail of what I'm talking about. So we had low density around 3 stories, medium density around 6, and high density around 9. And the logic, although people watching may think, well, 9 densities is not high, 9 stories is not particularly high density. For existing, compared to the existing suburban form in outer London, 9 stories would be a relatively high density, or would be a high density development. Just one thing to note as we go through, that the low density option at around 3 stories, although we call it a low density option, it's still considerably higher than the existing densities at which the residential areas of outer London were built primarily during the interwar years in the 1920s, 30s, through into the early 40s. So this was a piece of survey work. We actually started the work prior to COVID and lockdowns. It proved to be very fortuitous when it came to carrying out the survey work online. We approached different community groups seeking their participation to send out the links to the survey. And in total, we had 939 residents from outer London who carried out the survey, which was as a random control trial. So not all of the participants saw the same set of images, and some were asked to rate their perceptions of the density, and some were asked to rate the acceptability of the density using our different treatments. We also, and I'll come to this later because it's important, apart from asking them to respond to the images of our treatments, of our design treatments, we also asked about the characteristics of the interviewees, so ethnicity, age, length of time they'd lived in the area, as well as some questions about their attitudes and beliefs, so how empowered they felt to express their views and to be listened to by the local authority, whether they thought there was a housing crisis in London, whether they thought new housing should be built in the suburbs or in inner London or across both locations. So this is just one of the many images that they were presented with. And as you can see in this case, the respondent is being asked at the top to respond to how dense they feel the place is. In other surveys, respondents were asked to rate how acceptable the density was. So this gives you a kind of feel of, this is a sort of a low density development with some green space fronting the building. And then this would be varied across different images so that people had buildings with different fenestration at low density, different amounts of green space at low density, different treatments of parking at low density, and then similarly at other densities. So turning to the findings, overall design had a limited effect. So it wasn't a kind of major game changer in terms of affecting people's perception or their acceptability of density. However, it was much more significant for the low density option images. So at low density options, there were more design interventions that had a positive effect. But the number of effective treatment declined rapidly for both the medium and almost disappears for the higher density options. So at medium and high density, the treatments did have an impact on perception. So in some cases, it's possible to have people perceive the density to be lower in medium and high density treatments. So design can make a difference in terms of perception, but what it didn't have any great effect on was the acceptability of the density. So even though the perception was lower using some design treatments at medium and high density, overall it was still rated as being less acceptable or unacceptable. And this was very noticeable as you went through from medium to higher density development. So in fact, the only significant treatment at higher density was the presence of pitched roofs on the buildings, which did make the buildings both perceived to be less dense and also made them relatively more acceptable. Turning to the other elements, so from the design, we found that there was some impact, but it was limited, and particularly if we were seeking to build at medium and high density, design wasn't going to get us off the hook of existing residents' resistance to new building at higher densities. Turning to characteristics, we found that perceptions of density increased with age and length of residence. So the older you were and the longer you lived somewhere, the more likely you were to perceive medium and high density as being higher density. Also it was higher for women, those who were of white ethnicity and those who were UK born, and also owner-occupiers and social renters. So all of those elements contributed to people perceiving densities in our propositions to be higher. In terms of acceptability, the acceptability of new high density development decreased with age, so it's the opposite of what we see above, as we may expect, and also decreased with length of residency. Population groups with significantly higher acceptable levels, so groups, characteristics that found density to be more acceptable overall were women rather than men, Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups rather than those of white ethnicity, those who are UK born, and again, private renters. So there were some characteristics that were important in perception and in acceptability. However, it's noteworthy that clearly for planners and for urban designers, these are given in an area. The length of time people have lived there, the composition of the area are givens. So we also looked at attitudes as something that was obviously more amenable to change. And here we found that attitudes were a powerful influence, and that attitudes could reduce both the perception of density and make density more acceptable under particular circumstances. And some of those, the most significant, which is the one I have on the slide, is that where people were reported being convinced that there was a housing crisis in London, those people were reported finding the densities, they perceived them, the densities they were presented with as being relatively lower than other people, and they also reported finding them relatively more acceptable. And then other factors that were important was whether people believed that new housing should be built in inner London or outer London, and that unsurprisingly, those who thought that new housing should be focused primarily in inner London also found the densities to be less acceptable. Those who thought that there should be new housing development in outer London found the density to be higher densities to be more acceptable. And as I mentioned earlier, a sense of agency was also important. So if people felt that they could influence their local authority, they also tended to perceive the density to be less in the options they were presented with, and they reported it as to be more acceptable. So in conclusion, alongside design, attitudes related to the need for density, these are open to change, And these are potentially powerful policy arena to further the delivery of new housing on brownfield sites in the suburbs. The characteristics which I talked about could obviously inform planners about the likely levels of resistance they may meet, but they are more of a fixed entity, whilst beliefs, views about housing and the need for new housing was something that were both amenable to change. People could arguably be brought into conversation and persuaded of the urgency of the housing crisis. And we see in this research that changing those attitudes has a powerful effect on people's perceptions of density and the acceptability of density to existing residents. And that's the end of reporting there.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's nice to have a study that echoes also Beatrix's study, and it will make a very good conversation, I believe. So now we have time for questions and comments. And the first one that unfortunately we can't avoid is about COVID-19. Do you think residents' perception regarding spaciousness may have shifted since the start of the pandemic, and do you think you would have had maybe slightly different results if you had started your study in March or in April? Maybe we could start with you, Javier.
Yes, sure, happy to take that one first. In thinking about it, and after talking to the residents there, it would be very interesting to go back now. I know some of them I could make those questions again. But I could anticipate actually the answers being either stronger than before in terms of appreciating that spaciousness now. One of the, or some of the few really strong consequences of COVID-19 and lockdown, you could argue, is you stay more time indoors at home, you commute less, so the lack of the shortfalls in public transport would be less significant for the answers to these questions. So I guess the appreciation for wide open areas just outside their homes is even more important. Being able to leave their homes and have that feeling of spaciousness and open air, I think it would only be stronger.
And what about you, Beatrix? Do you think people would perceive a street as more dense if they had the threat of COVID-19?
I really enjoyed the mix of speakers, and I think I'm still tussling with how to define perceived urban density and what the factors are. But I think for sure the acceptability of what is too much has definitely changed. I think now with everybody working at home office, suddenly noises, light, all these kind of factors that maybe didn't matter so much before. So I appreciated the mix of methods actually that each of us brought in. Yeah.
And there's a kind of perception and ideas that if we build more and denser, maybe it will be more affordable. What do you think of this concept, of this idea, and has this influenced your study? Starting maybe with Alan, has affordability been a factor in the response from your respondents?
Yes, I think you are too, but I'm just reading one of the questions that says, was there any consideration of respondent sentiments on whether building new housing would actually lead to housing becoming more affordable? And I think it's a good question. The brief answer is no. And the reason for that is because we were presenting people with a relatively large set of images in order to, it was a sort of requirement of the randomization of the imagery that we were presenting them with, and because we were presenting them with various treatments times different densities, we constrain the number of questions we asked them beforehand about both their personal characteristics and the attitudinal questions. And I think one of the things that the findings suggest, given the significance of personal views and attitudes in terms of making density more acceptable, I think it would be really interesting and worthwhile for us to progress the study by spending more time on those attitudinal questions. And I think one of those would be around perceptions of, if this were providing housing for, often the term used in the UK, but local people, whatever that means, but also if it's more affordable housing, the extent to which this would impact people's perceptions of density. So I think it's a good question, and I think it's something we would certainly return to.
A question I have is how important is understanding density, and how perception of density from especially residents and citizens' perspective can be used as a tool for planners. What would you say is the most important thing to do with your research that you're presenting, and how it can better serve planners in the future? Maybe Javier or Beatrix, if you have an idea.
Happy to chip on that one. I mean, it's all very interesting, really. And it was really good to see some of the conclusions from Beatrix's study as well. And she was reflecting on some of the findings, like visibility. And the other one I kind of wanted to touch upon is the relation between the built matter and the crowdedness, right? So first on the visibility, I found certain parallelisms with that. And when I was asking the interviewees, to the residents, some of the responses I was getting is, we get out and we can actually see the sky. And so it's about that feeling of open air and visibility that really drives people. And then the relation between built matter and crowdedness. Crowdedness has a massive impact on their feeling of density, right? Following Beatrix's study, if I understood it correctly. So the built matter is almost a bit of a constant, right? So I think one of the key probably points in further research is understanding what elements of the design can actually change that. So you accommodate that design to people's perception of density. I think it's probably one of the keys to try to kind of merge the two of them and make them come together to increase certain acceptability of density.
For sure, and I think that to date we're working with a definition of density that's only related to built matter, when you could argue exactly the opposite. It's actually all about how many people use the space. And I'm currently working on creating a platform whereby non-experts, so residents, neighborhoods, groups can estimate what the effect of a new development is, because if a new housing project goes up, a lot is said about the density of that building in relation to the block, but what's the effect on everyone else, and how can they access that information? What are the tools that the experts are using that could actually be employed by resident communities to understand, okay, how many more people are going to be present? What's the effect of light and shadow and noise, all of that?
And we have a question for Alan about his what's considered as high density in the built form. The question is, high density housing takes different forms. Terrace housing can be almost as dense as high rise, which with a compensation in terms of more green space. Did you try out different formats and features?
Yes, so what we were interested in was trying, as I say, we use height as a proxy for density, and I'm aware that that is in itself contentious, because as the questioner rightly notes, there are different ways of producing density that aren't necessarily always directly reflected in height. However, what we wanted to do was test if we had a given area of land, and we were really interested in testing higher density expressed through different heights, because we were really interested in the design interventions on the building and looking at the vernacular effect on the building. And partly the way we proceeded reflects the limitations of the study, in that we were having to show a fixed image, in effect, I suppose, a shop window, or the front side of the site. We had Beatrix's walkthrough. We could have taken people through different sites with different treatments of density and height. So in that respect, we are limited by showing a kind of shop window view of different options. So I guess the short answer to the question is no, but partly constrained by the form of the research.
And there's also a question for Beatrix about floor area ratio, and how was the floor area ratio and perception related to context floor area ratio?
I think the question is really like at the crux of it. You can have very different spaces with an identical floor area ratio. So if you're entering a competition, you could argue that they both. Then, as an architect, what you're doing is you're differentiating the space. I think how we define urban density, the use of floor area ratio, whether there is scope to include a factor about presence of people, that's really at the crux of it. I didn't standardize across floor area ratio for the images I showed in part one, but they are all from the same neighborhood in Zurich, so the FAR doesn't differ that much.
And there's a question about population density and build density, and this is something that I was faced with also during my research on, like, it's so difficult to understand when we talk about density, what kind of density we're about, because often when we build new buildings, they're not lived in by the people that they were built to. For example, there's a lot of one beds that are occupied by families in London, and a lot of 3 beds that are occupied by single households with single people. And I was wondering how you approached this difference in people density and build density in your studies, and how we can combine the two in better understanding how spaces function.
That's me again.
Yes,
Yeah,
if you want.
I think ideally, currently there is no standard combined measure. So ideally, one would use a mix of measures and indicate why it's not just built matter, but also population density. What do you mean by population density? How do you define it? People define it differently. But what I'm working towards is trying to establish a hybrid measure that would become possibly the new normal. For example, when we talk about density, it's crazy that urban density is such an important term and people actually use it differently. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done still.
Yeah, I think this points to some of the limitations of using density and focusing on density. And I think the question of numbers of people, I thought Beatrix's work was really interesting for this kind of picking up on the crowdedness of areas. But I think that for me also works as another proxy, which is that people are, I think, perfectly rationally concerned that if we increase densities, if we increase numbers of people in an area, this represents competition for existing urban resources, whether that's public transport, health services, education services. For me, this comes back to the wider kind of conversation away from density, the wider conversation with people about understanding both the need for more housing, the need for affordable housing, but also having very open conversations about competition for resources. People will rightly be concerned that more density means more people, means more competition for resources. And I think it seems to me perfectly rational for people to have concerns about that. And that we need to have very open conversations about how we manage and how we provide those resources that we need in order to support higher density. Somebody in the chats, I think, made a comment about that we've kind of bought into the higher density without buying into the higher package of services and facilities that we need in order to support higher density. And I think that's a good point.
And do you think understanding density better at the planning stage could potentially help in getting these infrastructures in place before the buildings are constructed? Maybe Alan again?
Yeah, to some extent. I think as I say, I think the concern around density acts as a sort of proxy for concerns around levels of service provision declining, especially in the UK in terms of austerity for many years, declining public services, declining public transport, etc., etc. So I think that to the extent that concerns around density are acting as a proxy for those concerns, I think they're very legitimate concerns. And I think we have to, I think at the planning stage, we need to demonstrate the ability to provide those services at a sufficient level as areas become more densely developed, and importantly, more people are living in an area and using services.
Thank you. We're getting to the end of this event. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to make a last statement before we close. Javier, would you like to say something?
Thank you, Fanny. Well, everything was really, really exciting discussion. Maybe just saying that there's a lot to be done. As I think it's still clear from the presentations and the discussion, a lot to find out about density and residents' perception. But I think I will, as a practitioner, I will still trust in the design and how design can actually help us a great deal to achieve successful outcomes on this.
Thank you. Beatrix?
I agree. I thought this was a nice event, and I think there's a potential for more collaboration. Context plays a huge role here, and so being situated countries and makes a difference. So I look forward to a continuing conversation.
Thank you. And finally, Alan.
Yeah, I guess my takeaway from today, and obviously I was involved with the work that Javier's done, but I think for me, I suppose my takeaway is the importance of understanding density from a public perception and taking seriously concerns that are expressed around density, not simply dismissing them as being sort of reactionary responses, but really working with some of the fine grain of those responses.
Thank you so much. Thank you for attending this event. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to answer all the questions, but we will make sure to forward them to our speakers so they can have a chance to reply to you. Our next event will be on the 25th of November at 8:30 UK time. It will be about planning for sea level rise with the example of the UK, and Hawaii. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you, Fanny. Thank you, everyone.